Yeah, we are 1 minute ahead of time, but we would like to open this panel now. Yeah, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today in the Innovation Zone at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And I welcome you here, the audience who is joining us here in person, but I would also like to particularly welcome our audience on the screens, wherever from the world you are joining in and watching this panel. This panel is on actions for a global, green, and just transition. My name is Angela, and I'm from the Ban Ki-moon Center, and it's my great pleasure to have the opportunity today to discuss with these great panels coming from different backgrounds and perspectives giving us insights on just transition, the status quo, and the way ahead. As we are speaking here right now, we are facing several crises in the world. Crises mean stress for societies, for environment, but history of humankind had also taught us that crises also mean fuel for change. And this fuel for change we perceive as also necessary and therefore the just transition. First of all, let me introduce you again, just that we're all at the same point. What is just transition? And if we look into the definition of the International Labour Organization, just transition is greening the economy in a way that is fair and inclusive as possible to everyone concerned, creating decent work opportunities and leaving no one behind. This involves maximizing the social and economic opportunities while minimizing and carefully managing any challenges. It's my pleasure to welcome here today our panel, and let me first of all introduce them to you. On the left we have Lisa Kerbill. She is Head of Secretariat of the Joint SDG Fund, promoting cross-sectoral partnerships for progress towards the SDGs. A very warm welcome. Beside her we have Marcus Barrett, Global Managing Director and Global Lead of Industrials at Roland Berger Consulting. He has 25 years in consulting experience. Then we have Eleanor Webster. She's Head of Secretariat at Mission Innovation and is also working still on UK negotiations. Then next we have Nina Callaghan from South Africa. She's a researcher at the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University, focusing on researching on coalitions to support sustainable development. And then Catherine Neeb, she's Chief Sustainability and Philanthropy Officer at Duke Energy, with a broad experience and portfolio, working also in between NGO and private sector. A very warm welcome again on this panel, and dear panelists, I would like to open the discussion with a very big question, starting with you, Lisa. So, just transition, we won't start discussing do we need it or not, but the question today is, where are we right now from your institutional perspective? What is working and what is not working, and why not?
Thank you so much. Delighted to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to represent the United Nations in this panel. What's missing for just transitions? Here we are at COP. The Secretary General told us to cooperate or perish. Prime Minister Mia Mottley talked about the inequity of investments around the world and how emerging economies are up against not only the extra threats of climate crises, but also the realities that interest rates for investing in certain parts of the world are triple or quadruple what they might be in the developed world. So there are many, many challenges. The United Nations is here with stakeholders like the ones on this panel to de-risk and be a part of that conversation. We are not meant to be the largest asset managers, far from it. We're meant to be a neutral broker and convener for how to bring together partners to change the way business is done, to bring Wall Street, to bring Silicon Valley, to bring multinationals to the ground where we are making sure no one is left behind, from the small island developing states to least developed countries across the globe. Thanks.
Thank you. Marcus, coming from the very private sector perspective, what is the status quo from what you experience talking to many CEOs around the globe?
Well, First of all, I have I mean, of course, I know the official definition and the activities around just transition. I have a bit my own interpretation of that, which links, I think, nicely into it. An average person on Earth, roughly 5 tons. The people here in the room, probably something like 50, 60, 70 to 100, simply based on our mobility and consumption profiles. So I think we created the problem, and we need to fix it. And that's the key message I'm trying to pass, we are trying to pass to all the executives. We have the privilege, the power to meet on an everyday basis. And the message sinks in. Everybody is clear on that. If you talk with management teams and investors these days about their business model, 2 years ago, the key question was always, how sensitive is my business model? Where are the key risks? That discussion doesn't take place anymore. You only talk about the opportunity which is originating out of this for the companies. At the same time, we have to understand that at the moment, a lot of businesses, a lot of business models are really under very big pressure. We have clients where you have 15 to 20 task forces running in parallel. One still a bit on lockdowns and pandemic. You have others on gas shortage. You have a task force on chip shortage. You have a task force on energy saving, because some of our clients spend 20% of their revenue on energy, and these 20% went up a multiple of 5 to 10. So business models are stressed, which creates a great opportunity, and hope we're going to talk about this during the session here, because it's totally opening minds and it sinks in.
Thank you, Marcus. Eleanor, from your perspective, mission innovation, what's the status quo and where are the barriers to the trust transition?
Yeah, hello everybody. Great to be here. So mission innovation, for those that don't know, is a global initiative which looks to catalyze research and development and demonstration of clean energy to make sure it's accessible for all by the end of the decade. And I think, echoing what my fellow speakers have said already, that there are a lot of challenges out there, but there are also a lot of opportunities. And I think with mission innovation, day in, day out, we're working with governments and private sector across our 7 missions to answer common questions to common problems. And every day we're taking a step closer. I think all of us are acutely aware that we don't know what we don't know. So whilst we're answering questions that we have right now in terms of how to close gaps in NDCs, are we missing technologies, that kind of question, we need to make sure that when we know where we want to go, the research and development community is ready to start answering that question. So we're on a track and we're answering questions right now, but questions will keep coming up and we need to answer them quicker and quicker and quicker. So we're working on it right now, but we're also aware that there'll be questions coming to us all the time and we're ready for it.
Thank you. Nina, your South African research perspective that you bring in, where do you see just transition right now?
Thanks, Angela, and hi, everybody. Good to be here. I'd like to just pick up from what Marcus said. Marcus, you're my friend on this panel in the way that you opened, to acknowledge a greater global injustice. It's something that we don't talk about. It's something maybe we pretend we don't know. That there is a major extraction from north, from the south by the north, and that the south really subsidizes hyperconsumption in the global north. It's not just a matter of who is more responsible for emissions already produced, but it is a current reality. So the kinds of extractions that happen is that if the global south imports something from the global north, they pay 5 times more in terms of units of land 3 times more in terms of energy, and 13 times more in terms of labor. So when we think about a just transition, we need to be asking ourselves, why is it so hard for global south countries to access transition finance? I think that's a question that we really need to interrogate in a global view of justice. I think for South Africa, we are very much focused on a just energy transition. You can't sit in a room and talk about an energy transition. You'll be asked to leave. And so I think South Africa, since Glasgow, has made substantial advancements to really prepare for our just energy transition. We have come together to coordinate institutions, local institutions, to work with multilateral organizations to negotiate the 8.5 that was pledged in Glasgow. And happily, I am a proud South African, despite all of our blackouts, despite all of our debt. We have managed to bring to COP27 a just energy investment plan, which makes systems change a transactional reality. It's on paper. There are places to invest. Green hydrogen is one of the new areas, electric vehicles another. And one of the key components is building out the national grid and increasing generation. Built into all of those areas are priorities for justice. And maybe later on in our conversation, we'll really just dig into what those areas of justice are for us. Thanks.
Happy to. Thank you, Nina. Catherine, from the private sector perspective, Duke Energy, please, what's, from your perspective, the status quo and the biggest barriers?
Yeah, well, thank you. It's also nice to be here with my fellow panelists and with all of you. So for context, Duke Energy is the largest energy company, electricity provider in the United States. And we have a commitment to get to net zero across 95% of our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. One of the most critical ways we're going to achieve our net zero commitment is a full exit from coal. And so for us, the just transition is really at the heart of our clean energy transformation. For background, we have already retired 56 coal units, representing a roughly 7,500 megawatts of energy, and we have 16 gigawatts to go. So this is the largest planned retirement of coal in the United States. And so to help inform our work, we have just released a set of just transition principles, building on what we've learned through our own retirements about what works and what is necessary, and then learning and looking across other industries and listening to many of our stakeholders about what they think is really important to them as it relates to the just transition. And so our principles really center around 4 things: employees, customers, communities, and economic development. For employees, we currently have, of our 30,000 strong workforce, around 1,500 people currently work in coal facilities today. So really thinking in about and honing in on what are the skills that we can equip those workers with so that they navigate towards the next version of energy generation, et cetera. For communities, it's really about having them be a part of the discussion about what a just transition looks like for them, because while these things I think are often talked about at a high kind of academic level, for Duke Energy, we're really talking about communities in our backyard, and we absolutely need them to be engaged in the conversation about what comes next. As we think about customer, here I think reliability and affordability are tantamount, but I would also argue access. So am I able to access the clean energy that is generated? And then finally, as we think about economic development, it's looking very specifically at our coal generation sites and understanding what specifically may come next in that community. Because as you think about some of these coal facilities, they are sometimes one of the largest sources of property tax in that community. So paying for things like fire trucks, for schools, for roads. So really wanting to make sure that we're thoughtful about those impacts as well.
Thank you, Catherine. And we will come back to those details in a second. Maybe Nina, because you already opened the floor and saying, okay, let's discuss about the different elements of that are included in Just Transition. Would you like to continue? And from your perspective, what does it include?
So I think for South Africa, we are not just recovering from COVID, we're also recovering from apartheid, and we're also recovering from colonialism. It's been a more than 300-year history of a fossil fuel intensive economy that has marginalized the majority of South Africans. So our opportunity to decarbonize also means including those who have been left out. Decarbonization must solve for development problems and economic problems in South Africa. Without doing that, it is only an energy transition and not a just energy transition. I know that leadership in South Africa, in the highest echelons as well as on the ground, are really invested in articulating what justice means in our South African context. And there is an institutional body that sits in between the state and society, and it was formed by the president, and it's called the Presidential Climate Commission. And their mandate is to arrive at a national consensus of what just energy transition means. And there are three components. Procedural. Procedural justice is about having voices at the table in national dialogue. Those who are usually marginalized and unheard must be heard, and their ideas and designs incorporated into national plans. So this is something that the Presidential Climate Commission itself has undertaken, doing extensive community consultations, sometimes well, sometimes not so well, but it's a process that was critical to how we understand just transition. The other aspect is distributive justice. And this is really about the reallocation of resources and who bears the risk and who pays for it. So it's not just a nice phrasing, but it really translates into policies as well. Labor market policies, retraining of workers, reskilling of workers, not only coal workers, but those also in the informal sector who depend on the coal value chain. We're also thinking about policies to stimulate small business. That's also part of redistributive justice. And with so many coal workers standing to lose their jobs, we also must provide for retirement packages and compensation, and especially health compensation for those who have lost their health within the coal mining industry. Distributive justice also includes industrial policy. How do we create an industrial policy that creates the conditions for a green economy, and especially a renewable energy-led industrialization? Restorative justice is about taking cognizance of the past, present, and future. Past damages, future damages, not only for people, but also for the environment. So these are the three tenets that's included for us: procedural, redistributive, and restorative.
Thank you, Nina. Well, you were mentioning now a very important phrase. It's having all the voices at the table. You know, that's how Just Transition is understand, leaving no one behind. Lisa, from the SDG Fund's perspective, how do you make sure that all the voices are heard and on the table, and that we ensure a people-centered approach?
No, I was thinking as Nina spoke, the human rights approach of our United Nations, of our General Assembly, which is where all of our governments met in 2018 to create a startup, to create a blended finance institution within the United Nations development system. That's the joint SDG Fund. And what we try to do is de-risk the very investments, to de-risk the just transitions that look at the entirety of development. And that means it has to be rooted in those who most often are left behind. So in the case of our projects, you could take a Uruguay. Uruguay is one of our top catalytic investments where the government seeks to take its entire transport sector solar. So they're going to have solar buses, solar taxis, et cetera. Uruguay might not be on the radar screens of many private equity and other asset managers. I'll ask Marcus later. But the point is, how does the UN become that de-risk partner so that the voices of government of Uruguay, but then also how do we incorporate civil society to make sure that when those buses turn solar, more than 50% of the drivers will be female? How do we make sure that youth empowerment and training means that we're building a whole ecosystem of opportunity and growth around a solar transport and renewable energy system? That's the kind of programs that we're trying to socialize to investors, to member states and partners. Why? Because we can't wait for capital markets to find the Uruguays, the Malawis, and the Fijis. Our event just now on the small island developing states highlighted that every third breath we take is from the coral basin, the carbon sink of the Pacific Ocean. Every third breath. That's how expansive the Pacific Islands are, and yet there's only 10 million people living in the Pacific Islands. So when we look at economies of scale, small island developing states are often left out. So another role of the UN is to make sure we balance out this opportunity so that we can take some of global funding that's managed and take it to where it's needed most. Thank you.
Marcus, do you maybe want to pick up the question from Lisa already?
Yes, absolutely. And just transition, the transition in general, but especially the just transition, is actually a dilemma which is a perfect example of what we, during our university time, learned as external effects. And one of the key problems in that case is that everybody is kind of waiting for the other one to define. 3 years ago, just before COVID, I've been sitting in the boardroom of a US car company, trying to push them towards acceleration of investment in everything around electric driving. And people were looking at me saying, yeah, but look outside there. Our customers want to buy F-150s, pickups. So you talk to the customers, they would tell you, I would immediately switch, but there are no good cars that I can buy. Then you look at the government, you look at other institutions, everybody waiting a bit for the other ones to act. So our key message to our clients, including financial investors, is everything is there, you just need to do it. And I think it's mainly around 3-4 topics. First one, and when we talk to company management, of course, their mission is not to solve all the problems on this earth, but they focus on how they can generate value and contribute, because, as said, we created the problem, we have to fix it. That's a moral obligation. So, first topic is around top line. This is getting a real business opportunity for a lot of companies and investors, mainly around monetization of new technologies. In your example, democratization, decentralization of energy production, supporting those local communities in getting less dependent on the central systems, one big lever. Another big lever is everything around recycling. During one of the events yesterday, we gave stage to a startup, Nigerian startup, Recycler. Great company. They started with the idea that they want to avoid that people are, bothered by too much waste around them. So they took waste out of the system. And now they realize they make a profitable business model out of this, because the big corporates need recycled plastic. They ship it back and they save thousands of tons of CO2. So top line. Operating model, the way you run your business. Consultants are not a good role model. And that's increasing our obligation. Not a good role model in CO2 footprint. We are heavy travelers. We used to be heavy travelers. And I can be very direct open here. Our per person CO2 footprint per year before COVID was around 15 tons per employee. We are down to 5, maybe even a bit below, because of a total different travel scheme, but also total different incentive scheme. Our EV ratio in the lease car park is around 80% because we incentivize electric, we penalize propulsion. So the way you run your operating model. Third one is around decision processes. The management teams, it's one of our key messages, need to factor in their decision making, all the external cost and how they can contribute in the problem we have to solve. And last but not least is a very important dimension around HR. So we are talking about training, recruiting, again, incentive systems, the way you promote your people, the way you select your people, this whole cultural and justice dimension we talk about is now playing a totally different role in selecting the right people to make the careers than before COVID. And by the way, maybe we still have a minute later on to touch on that, but I think COVID really was a total game changer because it showed, at least to our clients, that totally unthinkable problems and situations can be managed if people are determined, pragmatic, funds are there, and that should be feasible to get the funds for the biggest problem we have.
Thank you, Marcus. Yeah, and you were mentioning something important. Everything is there, you say. You just need to do it. So let's talk now about the opportunities that are out there. Eleanor, from your perspective, you're working a lot in international corporations. What are the opportunities you see? And maybe you also can give us a best practice example, but you say, okay, this is where it works really well.
Yeah, no, sure, great question. I think there's a couple of things that I think are really, really positive that have happened this year. One of them is the Working Groups 2 and Working Group 3 reports from the IPCC. And I think, speaking to what Marcus said, we already know a lot, and those reports showed us some very, very helpful pieces of information. And we understand where we need to get to, and we also understand things about social, institutional government arrangements. So we know where we need to get to, and we know that this is a multidisciplinary problem. Equally, last year, the COP26 presidency launched a breakthrough agenda, which I think moving forward will be very helpful because it takes that sort of global picture across sectors and really helps to steer the ship and points all as actors in the right direction to work collaboratively and work together. And those two things I think are extremely powerful. And I think certainly the role of mission innovation is to capitalize on that and bring people together, because I think one of the most powerful tools that we've got right now is our lessons learned. And there's lessons being learned over here and there's over here. And what we need to do is we need to bring them together because that will really help us move forward much more quickly. And having spent time on the other side negotiating, there's lots of conversations going on about there, and there's a conversation in this room and in this room, and it's starting to come together, which is great to see. But what I want to point out is that there are a lot of people outside the negotiating rooms picking up that Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 report and taking it forward. And really, my priority right now is to continue. We have 7 missions. Going back to the concrete example idea, one of our missions is urban transitions, and what that's doing, I think it's on Tuesday, but don't quote me on that. I've got a lot going on in my head at the minute. Is the launch of the next phase of the urban transitions mission, and we have 50 cities signed up to start to implement some of these things that we're learning about, and we're going to do it together. We're going to do it as a community, and we're going to watch as these cities develop with some of these solutions that we're talking about. And I think that that's really exciting. And that has come out directly from the lessons we've learned through the UNFCCC, through what the IPCC have picked up. So all of these things work together, but there are a lot of people on the ground doing stuff right now, and we're going to start to see that more and more. But the power is in collaborating and learning from each other.
Thank you. And I mean, sometimes when you're here at COP walking around, you tend to forget whom you're actually talking for sometimes, right? That there are actually people, right, like you, Nina, also mentioned, people are suffering right now from the consequences. So we have to be sure the responsibility that all of us take, that for the power that we have to ensure to do the best and speak up for them. So, Catherine, I would be interested, as you're working in the private sector in the US, what do you expect from government? Which kind of framework that enables you also support for a just transition?
So where we're really focused, actually, let me take a step back. So when we model how we're going to get to net zero, we need some kind of policy. And the traditional way of adding in a policy has been a carbon tax that helps kind of force your emissions all the way down to zero in the US. We're a regulated utility, so we really do need to work with and get the approval from our regulators for the actions we're taking to decarbonize, keep the lights on, keep the bills low. We recently in the US had the IRA, the IIJA. These are, I think, really important policy mechanisms that almost flip the script a little bit in the US for the utilities, where rather than adding a cost to get to net zero, they take cost out of the transition, which I think is a really critical enabler. I'm a big believer that the pace of environmental progress occurs at the speed of social change, and that we really need to be driving the net zero agenda forward, thinking about the just transition, thinking about issues like environmental justice, thinking about issues like affordability, thinking about who's got access to some of this energy. Is it equitable? Is it fair? And so I think when you've got a very constructive environment from a policy standpoint, you're able to drive progress even faster. Another thing that I would highlight is the state of North Carolina, which is where Duke Energy is headquartered and where we have a large operational footprint, recently passed a bipartisan policy piece of legislation that basically requires us to get to roughly 70% emissions reduction in kind of the early 2030s. And so that's a really, I think, powerful example of us working with government to try and figure out across the state, where do we all want to go and how quickly?
Thank you. Nina, from South Africa, how do you observe the involvement of the government and also the responsibility in terms of financing and what the recent developments in South Africa have brought through to build progress on this?
I think I mentioned earlier, the World Bank has declared South Africa one of the most unequal country in the world. We have a 34% unemployment, 64% unemployment for youth, and 86% of domestic energy is produced by coal-fired power. We also have an aging coal fleet. So there are some very clear answers of what everybody needs to do, government, civil society, business. But I think, and Catherine, you said maybe like the rate of change happens at the rate of societal change, something like that. I'd also say it occurs at the rate of investments. And the clutch point for us is how finance could stymie South Africa's transition ambitions, South Africa's just energy transition ambitions. And leadership in South Africa has put forward this just energy transition investment plan that is very clear. You know, it gives priorities. It shows where there are opportunities. But I wonder about the rules of finance and how, Marcus, you've been saying for years and years, everybody says, we're ready, but nothing really happens. And I think I've been listening to a lot of conversations at COP. They've been dominated by finance, and they've been dominated by a kind of conversation which is about instruments and what are the constraints for industry and for the private sector. And I'm surprised at the lack of innovation in those conversations. What really does a return risk profile look like in a world guaranteed loss and damage? We're talking about managing loss and damage, not preventing loss and damage. If the conversation starts at instruments, how are we bringing the realities of real people into that finance conversation? And so I think when we think about coalition building for doability, for a just transition, I think finance is the area and business. We need to collaborate a bit more. I don't know if it's a matter of bringing in development finance institutions, understanding who else can guarantee investments, because certainly African countries' governments have paid through the nose to guarantee projects and investments on the continent. The cost of capital is 3 times more in Africa than it is in the UK or the EU or the US. What is this risk perception on the continent and for our country, for South Africa? I think we really need to interrogate what's inside of that. But I'm really encouraged by the leadership in South Africa. Our processes are not perfect. There are many gaps. Civil society is a very strong presence that holds government to account. But I think that we have shown some mettle and some muscle to make progress from the last COP. And we need donors and business to meet us. There are clear opportunities.
May I respond directly? I think there are two good news out of the past 2-3 years. First one, investors in many corporations we talk about, industry, car manufacturers, machine building, steel companies, when they take decisions, they normally have 30, 40 years horizon for their investment decisions, where they want security. That was the way you were able to operate business before the multiple crises we entered 2 or 3 years ago. That security is pretty much gone in a lot of investment areas. And that's recalibrating a bit let's say this pressure to require absolute security in the investment decisions you are making. So I'm sure people will get much more open to take risk, because what do you do today? You build your new plant in China as a US company in order to get less dependent from the logistical problems, and maybe in 1 year there will be sanctions, and your company there will be lost. So everything has got much more insecure, so bigger risk appetite. And the second big news, as I mentioned earlier, there are many, and it's pretty much an exponential curve, many more use cases which already have positive cash flow today on the energy side, on recycling, and on a lot of other sides. And the last point we are giving to all the CEOs we talk to, the responsibility of business in the past 2-3 years has even further increased. Because if you look around the geopolitical environment, and states and governments threatening each other, imposing sanctions to each other, our philosophy is that we need to make sure that our clients stay in talks with all the other countries, cooperate, coordinate, because governments will much more struggle on exactly that point. So business has to drive this. And as said earlier, this sinks in pretty exponentially.
Thank you, Marcus. Yeah, we're already coming towards an end of this panel. I would like very briefly, Lisa, what is the one thing that you expect, if you think about just transition, as a clear outcome of COP27 that would support and accelerate progress?
So I think the relationships that are deepening at COP are critical for the work that the UN is trying to propel forward. Exactly to this point, if we can de-risk investments, if we can be that first loss investor, and if we can socialize that to sovereign wealth funds, to institutional DFIs, asset managers, that there is a way to de-risk that. There is a way to start to stack capital for change. I think that's important. It's a struggle to understand the breadth of the stakeholders that are part of this just transition, And we're all entering, I think, at different entry points. So how do we connect the dots, I think, is the challenge. But I do see tremendous openness to engaging and to understanding our different roles, because we are admitting, maybe only now, that we don't all come with the same strengths, and many of us don't always come with the same opportunities, but that's something we can overcome. So I think I have hope that we are seeing commitment. It is about financing, but I do agree that that will set the pace.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Yeah, it was a great pleasure. Thank you to the great panel for sharing your expertise. And let's not forget now, when we talk in the next days and months and years about just transition, of having the people in the center of all our conversations to make sure there's a just transition overall. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.